Her hands almost shook with anger. If not for the onlookers and the surveillance camera, Manuela would have definitely expressed all her thoughts about the cashier. Quickly packing her groceries into bags, she thanked the man and headed for the exit. However, before reaching the door, she turned and said, "I will return everything, you can be sure of that." Manuela was genuinely grateful to the man because he had helped her in a difficult moment and saved her from further embarrassment. It's unknown how everything would have ended if the stranger hadn't paid the money and interrupted the cashier's offensive remarks, especially since she intended to continue humiliating Manuela. Interestingly, no one else in the line, besides the savior, even lifted a finger to reproach the insensitive cashier. Bending under the weight of the grocery bags, tears continued to stream from her eyes, but she didn't notice them. Today had turned into a dark day, even though just an hour or two ago her mood had been good. Manuela planned to cook oatmeal with milk for her children and offer them sugar cookies with tea. Her emotional state had become somber. Manilia, after waiting for Manuela to leave the store, the man who had helped her approached the cashier and confidently said, "You should moderate your zeal, my dear. Who do you think you are to allow such behavior?" "And who are you?" retorted the cashier. "I know you're new to this store and don't yet know that I am the owner of this supermarket chain, and this store is also mine. Remember that and behave more decently." In the commotion, the cashier hurriedly tried to flatter him upon realizing he was the owner. "Oh, Mr. Silva, you're here unexpectedly today. We thought you were on a business trip." "I had to return to check on my property," the owner replied angrily. "So, something like this happens. It is absolutely unacceptable." "What happened, Mr. Silva?" asked the senior cashier, putting on an innocent face. "Your protege insulted the customers." The owner pointed at her. "And what's even more offensive, the woman didn't have enough money to pay for her groceries. She was willing to leave some items behind, but the cashier didn't want to wait or was in a hurry for some reason, and she started calling her indecent names in front of everyone." "How dare you?" the owner directed his words at the cashier. "I'm sorry," said the cashier, lowering her head and feeling guilty. "I won't do it again, I promise. She was just delaying the line, and I had to hurry her." "Be careful with what you do, or you'll be quickly fired," the cashier was threatened. "Well, that's enough for now. Let's forgive her this time," Eduardo intervened. "But make sure this doesn't happen again. I will not allow customers to be humiliated in my stores, and relay this message to the rest of the staff, so that I don't have to abruptly fire anyone," Eduardo continued. "Yes, I understand," the cashier responded with a frustrated look. "I will print the memo immediately and distribute it to all employees. Please don't fire anyone. Let that be the last resort." "Fine, but it's your responsibility," Eduardo warned, pointing a finger. Surprised expressions spread among the people in line. It seemed the cashier had taken out her anger on a regular customer, a common occurrence in other stores, but the owner siding with the customer was unexpected. Eduardo Silva was either a patron or simply a very kind person. "Would you like some coffee?" "I just made some," the senior cashier offered kindly to the owner. "Not now, I have many things to resolve," Eduardo said, shaking his head as he left the supermarket. He caught up with Manuela and offered to help with her bags. "Let me help with those. They look heavy, and I don't mind carrying them." "Oh, you don't need to. I can manage on my own," Manuela responded with a heavy sigh, but still handed one of the bags to Eduardo. "I'm sorry for not introducing myself earlier. My name is Eduardo Silva," he said. "I'm Manuela," she replied. "Thank you again for your help. If it weren't for you, I would have been consumed by shame right there." "Don't worry about it. It could happen to anyone," Eduardo replied. As Manuela looked at him, she noticed his thin, pale appearance. Despite this, he was dressed respectably and didn't look like an ordinary person. In fact, he seemed quite well off. Eduardo immediately noticed Manuela's speculative look and revealed his identity. "I own a chain of supermarkets, and this is one of them." "Are you serious?" Manuela asked, surprised. Yes, indeed. I periodically check how my employees are doing. Today I came here and it seems it was the right decision. Discreetly inspecting your own properties, that's interesting, Manuela commented with amusement. There's nothing else to be done. You always need to keep a hand on the pulse, Mr. Silva stated with a hint of irritation. Otherwise they will perceive weakness and relax. I understand, Manuela agreed. But rest assured, I will return every cent. Relax. I said there's no need to return anything, Eduardo insisted. I don't care about that money. Manuela felt she didn't need to fear this man and could trust him. Eduardo acted nobly, despite the difference in their social status. Without realizing it, Manuela opened up to him and began to share her life story. The store owner listened attentively and responded with sympathy. It seemed they had found common ground and instantly became good friends. I grew up in a poor family, Manuela began. From a young age, I knew the value of money. We didn't have much wealth at home, so we had to save on everything. My mother worked as a meal carrier, and my father died due to a workplace accident. Unfortunately, no one from the administration helped with his funeral. He dedicated many years to that factory, and in the end, they didn't even provide a wreath for his grave. I'm sorry for being so blunt, but it's my habit to speak my mind. At that moment, Eduardo sighed deeply and started to feel itchy. Manuela noticed he didn't look well. Are you all right? Should I call an ambulance? No, I'm fine. I'll endure it. Please continue. Well, my mother raised me alone, Manuela continued. She did everything she could to ensure we had the basics to eat. I won't deny that we didn't have much, but I don't regret it. Living this way made me stronger. That's the most important thing. You faced many challenges, but never gave up. Many people I know couldn't find their way in life and just sank to the bottom of society. I got married young. That's just how it happened. Manuela continued her story. My husband was a good man, and everyone congratulated me, saying I had won the lottery of happiness. But for me, it was important that we were compatible in character. Eduardo nodded in response, and then looked off into the distance as if he had seen someone. Manuela squinted, trying to see, but there was nothing there. The road ahead of them was empty, as if everyone had disappeared instantly. Eduardo shook his head, as if clearing an invisible web. Eduardo looked back at Manuela and said with a smile, I've been listening to you, and hadn't realized the silence that had fallen. Yes, I also got lost in my thoughts, Manuela admitted, mentioning her marriage to Andre. We had 4 children. We were the happiest parents in the world. Eduardo asked cautiously, Why are you speaking in the past tense? Manuela lowered her head and whispered, My husband passed away. I'm so sorry. Eduardo stepped back involuntarily, thinking that Manuela would continue to tell how they raised their children and cherished each day together. Instead, it turned out this seemingly delicate woman had endured much sorrow in her life, and the incident in the store had only added to her troubles. After a brief pause, Manuela continued speaking about her family. Her husband was a construction worker, and his professional skills were highly valued. After their youngest daughter was born, he started considering a job change. Andre wanted to earn more money since they had enough to get by. But he dreamed of having their own house where everyone could live comfortably. This house would have rooms for the children and spaces to play and have fun. With this goal in mind, Andre decided to work abroad. Manuela, of course, didn't agree with the idea, but didn't openly oppose it either. She trusted her husband completely and believed he had thought everything through, especially since Manuela herself had long wanted to improve their lives, mainly for their children, so they would never lack necessities. With his wife's support, Andre set off on his journey, believing success awaited him. The anxious wait lasted 2 months. Manuela called her husband almost every day to check on him. Initially, he responded immediately, but later he only did so when he had free time. During this period, Manuela's heart began to fill with sickening worries, not about infidelity, as she never doubted André's fidelity, especially since he had given her no reason to. Unexpectedly, the news came that her husband had died in a car accident. André's supervisor reported that he had taken a few weeks off to visit his family, but didn't wait for the company transport and decided to hitchhike. Naturally, all his colleagues tried to dissuade André from this plan, but he didn't want to wait, especially since the company bus was scheduled to arrive only 3 days later. Manuela's husband didn't want to waste precious time, which turned out to be a fatal mistake. Midway through the journey, the truck driver he was hitchhiking with lost control on a curve, and the truck plunged into a river at high speed. The truck driver died on the spot without regaining consciousness, and André's body was, despite several days of search and rescue efforts, Manuela's husband's body was never found. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Eventually, the search was called off, and it was assumed that André's body had been swept away by the current in a place where it was impossible to retrieve him. This final piece of information was relayed to Manuela, and she had to come to terms with the fact that she was now a widow with 4 children to care for. Accepting this reality was incredibly difficult, but it seemed to be the fate that life had dealt her. Manuela spent several days crying inconsolably, and despite her family's and friends' efforts to comfort her, nothing seemed to help. All she could do was endure her emotional anguish and pray to God not to lose her sanity. Since André's body was never recovered, Manuela had to bury an empty casket containing her husband's belongings. She placed new clothes that André had not yet worn into the coffin, a magnificent suit he had planned to wear for his birthday celebration. She also included his black leather shoes, which André loved for their classic style and elegance. Manuela didn't hesitate to part with these items as a way to honor and say goodbye to her husband, wanting to preserve his memory in the most beautiful way possible. About a year had passed since then, and Manuela seemed to have adjusted somewhat to the fact that her husband was no longer by her side. Even the children had stopped asking, "Where is Daddy?" Initially, they would throw tantrums, demanding to find him because it was difficult for them to understand that he was in heaven. Only recently had the children fully grasped the loss of their father. Manuela recounted all this emotionally to Eduardo Silva. It seemed she had kept these feelings bottled up for a long time, and now everything was pouring out at once. The store owner walked beside her deep in thought, and Manuela felt that Eduardo was in a different dimension at that moment. His face was so tense that every vein and capillary was visible. Despite what people might say, even wealthy individuals are not devoid of compassion. Eduardo appeared so profoundly moved by her story that he visualized it in his mind, not noticing when Manuela took a photo of her husband out of her sweater pocket. "Here is my André," she said through tears, handing the photo to Eduardo. He studied the picture for several minutes, as if looking for something familiar in it. In the photo, André was smiling the way happy people do, with no reason not to be happy. A loving home and a caring wife surrounded him. The picture captured him in his full height with the clear features of a content person. "I feel for you, Manuela," Eduardo finally said after a long silence. "It's a tragedy for a family to lose a loved one." "Thank you for your empathy," Manuela replied. "Time heals, as they say." "Maybe, but not everyone can heal," Eduardo responded with sadness in his voice. "By the way, if you like, I can help continue the search for your husband. Even if the rescuers didn't find anything, maybe I can." Manuela answered with doubt in her voice. "It's unlikely that you'll have any success." "I'll try." "Maybe we can at least locate his body," Eduardo insisted. "Who knows? Maybe someone saw something or has some information." "I'd be grateful to you," Manuela said. "You've already done me a kindness. I don't know how to thank you." No need, Eduardo replied with a wink. I genuinely want to help. Manuela immediately sensed that Eduardo reacted irritably to her words about time healing. Cutting to the chase, she decided to ask, "Has your family also gone through some sorrow?" "Well, how can I say this?" Eduardo began, but Manuela interrupted for a moment. "Here we are. This is where I live." She pointed to an old 4-story building. "Let's sit on the bench, and you can tell me everything if you're not in a hurry." Eduardo nodded. "I, too, have had a difficult life, so I understand you better than anyone. My only and beloved son, Rafael, died while on a mission in a critical zone. For obvious reasons, I can't reveal exactly where, as it was a confidential military operation. I had so many dreams of having grandchildren, which is why I cherished my son so much," Eduardo continued. "We used to go fishing and hunting together, spending time at the countryside house, enjoying nature. What more could one need for happiness?" He paused, looking up at the clouds, and wiped his face as if drying water. "I never got to have grandchildren. My son never made me happy in that regard. 6 months after his death, my wife Leonore passed away. Her heart couldn't take it. The doctors couldn't do anything, just recorded her death. All of this happened before my eyes. I felt like I had fallen into a dark hole. My wife and son left me alone, perhaps to live and suffer." "Don't say that. They didn't do it on purpose." Manuela tried to console him. "Yes, as you can see, even the rich cry," Eduardo responded. "You've surprised me," Manuela said unexpectedly. "What do you mean?" Eduardo asked. "I never would have thought that a wealthy person would easily send their own son to serve in a dangerous place, to defend the country's interests. I think it's normal," Eduardo replied. "Every man should be a patriot of his country. Besides, my son made his own choice. I didn't insist. My wife and I offered him a career in our company, but he refused." "Your son was brave and valiant," Manuela added. "I'd say he was also responsible and determined." "There was no one else like him in that regard," Eduardo agreed. "Rafael always set his goals wisely and never backed down, regardless of the difficulties." "We're having such an honest conversation." Manuela stood up and pointed to the entrance. "Would you like to come in and have a coffee?" "Thank you very much, but if you don't mind, I'll have to decline," Eduardo replied, shaking his head. "Lately, I haven't been feeling well. The doctors talk about some tumor and insist on surgery, but like a child, I keep postponing it." "You're doing yourself no favors," Manuela shook her head. "I noticed your pallor immediately. Medicine is advanced these days. You shouldn't be afraid. Besides, you probably have options at a private clinic." "Oh, I'm not afraid. I just don't have the time." Eduardo forced a smile. "The pallor is due to blood pressure issues. It fluctuates. Sometimes it spikes, other times it crashes. I take medication, but they don't always help." "That's exactly why you need a proper evaluation," Manuela insisted. "Well, maybe another time, if I find the time," Eduardo conceded. "I'll look into your husband's case and try to find out something." "It's a pity you refused the coffee," Manuela said. "I'll be waiting for news." After that, they exchanged phone numbers and said goodbye. Eduardo Silva was indeed ill, but always delayed his treatment. It wasn't fear of doctors, it was the lack of someone to take over his business, especially now with the recent incident requiring even tighter control. The employees could easily take advantage and slack off, which he couldn't allow, as it would mean admitting his own weakness. To start the search, Eduardo needed the services of a detective. One such detective was Luis Souza. Before retiring, he worked as a senior investigator in the homicide division. Eduardo planned to meet with him without delay, unlike his own illness, which he continued to postpone. 40 minutes later, Eduardo arrived at the location and looked up at the windows on the 3rd floor where the detective lived. Luis was someone Eduardo had close ties with in his youth. As a young investigator, Luis had been involved in solving the death of a boy. Eduardo was, was a suspect because bloodstains and the victim's fingerprints were found at his house. However, it soon became clear he had been framed, and it was Sousa who proved it. He tracked down the real criminal and made the arrest himself. The young investigator was rewarded, promoted, and later earned a high rank. Luis built his career and became a senior investigator, eventually working as the head of the department for 6 months before retiring. Luis greeted Eduardo with a smile, saying, "Eduardo, it's been a long time since we last saw each other." Embracing his guest, he led him inside the apartment and immediately to the kitchen. "Let's have a drink to celebrate our reunion." "I won't refuse," Eduardo replied, patting Luis on the shoulder. "We've seen each other less often lately. I've been fully immersed in my business and you're always busy. That's why we don't meet as frequently as we used to. At least we remember each other's addresses," Eduardo said, extending his arms. "That's true. It means our brains are still working," Luis responded with a chuckle. "Well, let's drink." After finishing their drinks, they enjoyed salad and slices of ham that Luis had carefully taken out of the fridge. It's worth noting that his apartment was in perfect order. Every object and item had its designated place. Even during his time as an investigator, Luis had developed a strict discipline that he continued to maintain, despite his wealth, which could have afforded him an assistant. "You know, Luis, I didn't come to you without a reason," Eduardo Silva said, pushing the salad plate away. "I already guessed that. With a reserved person like you, sometimes I have to pull every word out. And after your son's death, you've become even more closed off," Luis responded, with a hint of frustration in his voice. "You should know it's a delicate subject for me," Eduardo replied, his voice tense. "Sorry, I went in the wrong direction," Luis said, raising his hands. "What happened? Tell me." "I need your help as a detective," Eduardo continued. "I know you've earned more in this field than in the police." "Oh, really? So Investigator Sousa isn't in fashion these days?" Luis joked. "Why would that be? Your skills have always been highly valued, but this time I need a detective. Believe me, I came to you with a good offer that will be hard to refuse." "Well, all right, I'm listening. Continue, and please be specific." "Today, I met a good woman named Manuela. We started talking, and she told me about the death of her husband. He was hitchhiking home when the driver of a trailer lost control, and the car fell into a river. The truck driver died, but they couldn't find Andre's body. That's Manuela's husband's name. Eduardo, you found a companion for life and want to get rid of the competition?" Luis joked again. "I appreciate your sense of humor, but Leonor is still in my heart," Eduardo replied with reproach in his voice. "Sorry, that was a bad joke. Continue." "So, she buried an empty coffin with her husband's belongings," Eduardo continued. "But I have doubts that he actually died." "Why do you think that?" Luis asked. "If the car fell into the river, there's a high probability that the current took his body, or wild animals could have consumed it," the detective speculated. "I've thought about that too," Eduardo agreed. "However, I'm asking you to take on this case. What do you say? Can you find him, or at least his body, so Manuela can give him a proper burial?" "I can't guarantee anything," Luis shrugged. "But I'll do everything within my power. Don't be offended if there's no positive outcome." "Of course I understand," Eduardo replied. "It's a challenging case. Traveling afar, there's no guarantee of finding anything. By the way, where did the accident happen? Let me jot down all the information Manuela gave me on a piece of paper," Eduardo said, pulling out a notepad from his inner pocket. He scribbled down the scant details he had at that moment. "It's not much, but it's something," Luis remarked, looking at the notes. "My business with one of my clients will be wrapped up in a few days, and then I'll take care of your case. Just don't delay," Luis promised. "Of course I've never let you down," the detective assured. "Who knows, when you find this person for me, we'll have a sincere celebration. I might even bring a 10-year-old brandy. Consider it." With that, they parted ways. Eduardo headed home, and Luis began calling his informants. He couldn't refuse to help his friend. After all, a strong friendship had formed between them ever since the case where Luis had literally saved Eduardo from prison. Over the years, they had remained steadfast, no matter how tough life became. As for Manuela, she was hesitant to believe Eduardo would succeed. It had been too long since the rescuers assured her it was all futile back then. Moreover, no one from the neighborhood had ever offered such help before, and suddenly the owner of a supermarket chain took on the search. She didn't believe in miracles, especially ones promising to fulfill any of her dreams. Yet she still dreamed of being with her husband again, though she had grown accustomed to dealing with her hardships alone. Having his strong masculine shoulder wouldn't hurt, she thought, but she understood that dreams rarely came true. Her husband wouldn't come back to life, and even if he did, it wouldn't be the same. Manuela grew increasingly anxious as time passed. She expected less from Eduardo, especially since he didn't provide any encouragement, always answering her calls with, "I'm looking into it. Have patience." Understandably, he couldn't be faulted. After all, he didn't have a database of all deceased persons in the country. But now, Manuela couldn't wait any longer because she earnestly wished for time to turn back. Weeks turned into more weeks, and Eduardo didn't provide any further information. At that point, Manuela stopped waiting. Meanwhile, Luis was digging deep, using all his connections to find the right people. One could say he was reversing the gears of history. He also didn't forget to update Eduardo. Eduardo called him periodically, and Luis responded, "I've made some progress in that direction. I think everything will come together soon." This was more than enough for Eduardo to believe in the detective's abilities. Luis persisted in his search, and soon his efforts paid off. He found him, lost, and held on to him like a man clinging to a lifeline. On that day, Manuela was at home because she had the day off. She had planned to spend quality time with her children. Unexpectedly, there was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting any guests, so she opened the door with great surprise. In an instant, her face contorted in horror because standing on the threshold was her husband, Andre. He looked pale, visibly thinner, and there was a red scar on his forehead. Overwhelmed with joy at her husband's return, Manuela started crying, drawing the attention of her children. Within a minute, they all gathered in the hallway as if by magic, crying out in astonishment. The apartment was filled with tears and exclamations of disbelief. Behind Andre stood Eduardo, smiling. It was clear that his help had been indispensable. Manuela had doubted him in vain. He had fully met the expectations he had assumed. Andre entered the apartment, surrounded by his children. For an hour, they didn't stop embracing and crying, but Manuela was more overwhelmed. She couldn't believe her eyes that her husband was alive. She pinched herself twice, thinking she was dreaming, but everything was happening for real. Andre tried to speak to her about something, but it didn't go very well, probably due to stress and emotion. Finally, Eduardo took charge of the situation and declared firmly, "I think it's time to clarify some things. What do you think, Andre?" "Yes, it's time," he agreed. Andre began his story, thanking everyone who had saved him and participated in the search. The tragic event occurred at night when he was on his way to meet his family. He was in such a hurry that he flagged down a driver who politely obeyed without thinking of the consequences. It was on a winding road with sharp curves, and it was precisely on one of those curves that the car lost control. In an instant, the truck veered off the road and rolled towards the river. They didn't even have time to react, because the speed affected the intensity of the impact. As a result, Andre's head hit a rock, and the current carried him downstream. He might have continued floating until he drowned or was devoured by wild animals. However, Andre was lucky. He was found by some hermits who had settled in the forest and made a living fishing. When they came across his body, they initially thought he was a corpse, but upon pulling him out of the water, they realized he was alive, albeit unconscious. The hermits took André to their humble cabin, where he spent a month in a delirious state, constantly calling out. No one could understand what he was saying because he whispered and mispronounced words. André was in a state of confusion, unaware of what was happening around him. Occasionally he would open his eyes only to slip back into oblivion. Curiously, the hermits didn't abandon him. They continued caring for him as if André had been given a second chance at life. Gradually he began to regain his senses, but couldn't remember anything connecting him to his past life. André struggled to piece together the facts, time, and events, but couldn't make sense of any of it. Frustrated and saddened, he attempted to take his own life, but the hermits intervened in time. They gave him a new name. Luis continued his search, and soon his efforts paid off. He found him, lost, and clung to him like a man grasping a lifeline. On that day, Manuela was at home because she had the day off. She had planned to spend quality time with her children. Unexpectedly, there was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting any guests, so she opened the door with great surprise. In an instant, her face contorted in horror because standing on the threshold was her husband, André. He looked pale, visibly thinner, and there was a red scar on his forehead. Overwhelmed with joy at her husband's return, Manuela started crying, drawing the attention of her children. Within a minute, they all gathered in the hallway, as if by magic, crying out in astonishment. The apartment was filled with tears and exclamations of disbelief. Behind André stood Eduardo, smiling. It was clear that his help had been indispensable. Manuela had doubted him in vain. He had fully met the expectations he had assumed. André entered the apartment, surrounded by his children. For an hour, they didn't stop embracing and crying. But Manuela was more overwhelmed. She couldn't believe her eyes that her husband was alive. She pinched herself twice, thinking she was dreaming, but everything was happening for real. André tried to speak to her about something, but it didn't go very well, probably due to stress and emotion. Finally, Eduardo took charge of the situation and declared firmly, "I think it's time to clarify some things. What do you think, André?" "Yes, it's time," he agreed. André began his story, thanking everyone who had saved him and participated in the search. The tragic event occurred at night when he was on his way to meet his family. He was in such a hurry that he flagged down a driver who politely obeyed without thinking of the consequences. It was on a winding road with sharp curves, and it was precisely on one of those curves that the car lost control. In an instant, the truck veered off the road and rolled towards the river. They didn't even have time to react because the speed affected the intensity of the impact. As a result, André's head hit a rock and the current carried him downstream. He might have continued floating until he drowned or was devoured by wild animals. However, André was lucky. He was found by some hermits who had settled in the forest and made a living fishing. When they came across his body, they initially thought he was a corpse. But upon pulling him out of the water, they realized he was alive, albeit unconscious. The hermits took André to their humble cabin, where he spent a month in a delirious state, constantly calling out. No one could understand what he was saying, because he whispered and mispronounced words. André was in a state of confusion, unaware of what was happening around him. Occasionally, he would open his eyes only to slip back into oblivion. Curiously, the hermits didn't abandon him. They continued caring for him as if André had been given a second chance at life. Gradually, he began to regain his senses, but couldn't remember anything connecting him to his past life. André struggled to piece together the facts, time, and events, but couldn't make sense of any of it. Frustrated and saddened, he attempted to take his own life, but the hermits intervened in time. They gave him a new name temporarily since he couldn't remember his own. Thus, André became João. He began helping his saviors fish to sustain himself because he couldn't just lie in the cabin staring at the ceiling. Besides, he hoped that by doing this eventually he would remember his past and find his way back home. I never imagined there were such kind-hearted people in the world. From that day on, Eduardo Silva embraced Manuela and André's family. He decided not to abandon people who had gone through so many trials and tribulations. After André fully recovered, Eduardo arranged for him to work as a distributor, responsible for supplying various products to stores. André enjoyed his work as it allowed him to reintegrate into society. Unbeknownst to him, Eduardo became like a beloved grandfather to Manuela and André's children. He visited so often that they considered him part of the family, especially the youngest daughter, who lit up whenever Eduardo came to their home. However, one day Eduardo fell ill and was urgently admitted to the hospital. Initially reluctant, he eventually agreed upon the doctor's insistence, recalling a tumor supposedly detected during an examination. With no other options, especially feeling worse lately, Eduardo reluctantly agreed. Manuela was deeply concerned and visited him nearly every day. André also visited, reassuring him that everything would be fine, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. Eduardo remained hopeful, especially with loved ones by his side. After a few days, Eduardo's condition worsened, and doctors decided a blood transfusion was necessary. However, they discovered Eduardo had a rare blood type, and none of his relatives were a match. Time was critical, possibly minutes away from the worst. The news came from the clinic where André was undergoing rehabilitation therapy. Eduardo was stunned, but gave his approval for the procedure. The doctor mentioned their blood types were similar in genotype. Eduardo couldn't believe such a thing was possible. As a result, after the transfusion, he insisted on DNA testing. Samples were sent to the lab for analysis, and they awaited the results. Meanwhile, Eduardo began to recover, hastily informing Manuela and André about the developments. The same day, they rushed to the clinic to personally congratulate him. "As you can see, medicine really works miracles," Eduardo praised. "I told you they would help you." Manuela rejoiced with joy and heartfelt gratitude. "If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now." André brushed it off modestly. "I just gave you my blood for the transfusion, and that's what helped," he replied. Eduardo Silva raised his index finger, implying there was more to the story he hadn't disclosed yet: the DNA test results. Remaining calm, Eduardo felt better day by day, thanks to the efforts of the doctors. He no longer felt fatigued, and the headaches that used to plague him had finally disappeared. The results arrived, and Eduardo was extremely surprised to discover that André was his son. But this couldn't be possible for him. Rafael was the only person he considered his true family, having invested his heart and soul in him. To dispel his doubts, Eduardo once again turned to Luis, who conducted a new investigation. The facts he managed to uncover were simply shocking. Eduardo had just been discharged from the hospital and arrived home to find Manuela and André waiting for him, having prepared a hearty meal and gathered the children. Upon seeing them, Eduardo asked them to follow him to the living room, stating he had a very serious conversation to have with them. "Did they not fully cure you?" Manuela anxiously asked. "Is everything not okay with that?" Eduardo shook his head. "They did a great job, even better than expected, but I've come to share some different information." "We're listening," André said. "How do I put this correctly?" Eduardo hesitated. "It seems that you, André, are my son." André nearly fell off his chair upon hearing this, immediately breaking into a sweat, his face turning pale. Manuela's eyes widened with disbelief, as she never expected such news. "I can't believe it. But how is this possible?" André asked, surprised once he recovered from the shock. "I couldn't believe it at first either. But then I read everything and convinced myself it's true, Eduardo replied, handing André the document with the DNA test results. André read it carefully, running a hand through his hair. "Well, this is truly shocking news," he pronounced after a moment of confusion. "I'm sorry, but I had to do the DNA test. It turns out that after they found the donor in you, they informed me that our blood types were similar. I didn't believe it, and that's when the doctors provided evidence after the procedure was completed. I contacted the lab. However, I still don't understand how this could have happened," Eduardo continued. "Let's find out soon," interrupted Manuela. "We'll find out soon," Eduardo replied. "I'll ask our detective to gather all the information about my son's birth." A few hours later, the doorbell rang again, and it was Luis. "Good morning," he greeted everyone cheerfully. He began to provide the information he had discovered. It turned out that there had been a fire in the maternity ward where Eduardo's wife was admitted. However, Eduardo only learned of this upon returning from a business trip. He was assured that his wife was unharmed and that everything was fine, but he was also informed about the birth of a son. Initially, it seemed like an incident that could be considered resolved. However, no one could have predicted that the babies would be switched due to the negligence of the medical team amid the chaos of the fire. All the infants were moved to a room, and in an unfortunate turn of events, the tags indicating Eduardo's son and another boy were lost. When the fire was finally controlled, everything was returned to its place, albeit with errors. The children were essentially switched, and Eduardo's wife received Luis, finished his story, and looked at his grateful audience. In the first 2 minutes, they didn't react much, especially Eduardo. But then he seemed to have a revelation. "So it seems I've been raising someone else's child all my life?" Eduardo asked incredulously. "It appears so," Luis replied with a touch of sadness in his voice. "But I don't see anything wrong in that. What matters is that you treated him as your own son." "You're right about that," Eduardo agreed, "but it's still a lot to take in." "Yet I've dedicated my heart to him," supported Manuela, "and he's been grateful to you for that." "So André, my only son," Eduardo affirmed, "and I knew nothing about him." "It's not your fault, Eduardo," the detective reassured. "Instead, think about how much happiness you've gained. If someone told me I could find my son, I'd jump for joy. I'm truly happy, just a bit confused right now." "Everything will be fine," Luis concluded. "The important thing is to accept this fact." "Well, it seems my mission here is complete. I must leave you now," Luis said. "Thank you very much." Manuela expressed her gratitude. "You've done so much for our family. I'll pray for you for the rest of my life. Good health and luck to you." "I really didn't expect this," Luis said awkwardly, "but thank you too, Eduardo. I'm always available if you need anything. Just give me a call." In response, Eduardo felt a sense of gratitude. When Manuela was bidding farewell to their guest, he finally regained his composure and embraced André in a paternal manner. Now he truly realized that his own son was before him. Tears streamed down the old man's face, and he didn't try to hide them. André was also moved, as he became a witness to significant events in his life for the second time recently. Manuela invited everyone to celebrate this momentous occasion. The reunion of father and son could not go unnoticed. Eduardo stayed the night at their house and slept in the children's room. But before that, he spent a whole hour telling stories to his grandchildren. Now he was a true grandfather, not just a guest, showering them with all his love. The next day, he invited everyone to his villa. There he had a large house where he retreated from the city's noise. Manuela noticed a small structure resembling a chapel and cautiously asked him about it. "In honor of my wife and son." "Yes, you're right," Eduardo felt. "I built it shortly after Rafael's death and later added my wife's initials too. They are buried together in the cemetery where our family chapel stands. I come here for solace and to speak with them." "I understand. I won't disturb you," Manuela said softly, leaving Eduardo alone. She instructed the children not to bother their grandfather for the time being. Meanwhile, as he stood near the chapel, André approached. He removed his hat and silently crossed himself. Each was lost in their own thoughts, wiping tears and turning to face his son. "I hope not to lose you again," Eduardo said quietly. "That won't happen, Dad," André replied firmly, embracing his father tightly. Manuela watched this scene from a distance, inwardly rejoicing that fate had returned her husband alive and even bestowed upon her a father-in-law. It seemed these events were not meant to happen. In her life, they spent several days in the countryside, relaxing, bonding, and having fun. During that time, Eduardo decided to make André his business partner, not wanting to waste any more time while he was still alive. He enrolled André in an accelerated financial education course. Initially reluctant, André agreed under pressure from his wife, considering the promising prospects it offered. Eduardo admitted to himself, "I'm not immortal, and I need a successor. There's no one else to pass the business to. In fact, I thought everything would be lost after my death." "Why do you think that?" "Things are going well after all," André reassured him. Eduardo shook his head. "I've been on the brink of the beyond for too long. Leonor and Raphael are waiting for me there. I see them in dreams every night." "All right, we have a deal. I'll try to grasp the intricacies of the business, and you promise me you'll set aside those thoughts," André said earnestly. During the courses, André absorbed all the information provided by the instructors, took meticulous notes, and practiced his skills. He realized that in the future, no one else to guide him through any difficulties that might arise. Eduardo also did not neglect his grandchildren. He created the most favorable and comfortable conditions. They, as Raphael had admitted, didn't have a chance to give this to him. But at least André brought 4 grandchildren. Eduardo spent time with them almost every day, taking care of them. Eventually, he decided that fresh air was much healthier and moved the family to that countryside house, which essentially became his property, as Eduardo made it clear that all his belongings would be passed on to them. He waited until his son immersed himself completely in business, then handed over the reins of power to him. All these years, Eduardo had been running like a squirrel in a wheel. It was time to make way for the younger ones and let them show what they were capable of. André proudly accepted this gift and promised that the stores would thrive under his leadership. He had already taken the first steps. However, there were still many challenges ahead. The supermarket chain gained prominent positions in the city. Their reputation spread throughout the region and even at the federal level. This naturally led to an influx of investments and placed the entire family in the spotlight. After some time, André sincerely confessed to his wife, "I never thought that recovering my memory would lead to so many consequences. I didn't expect our lives to change so drastically either," replied Manuela, having handed the business over to their son. Eduardo Silva dedicated himself entirely to his grandchildren. He moved to the countryside and spent all his free time with them. They were delighted with their father's company because he loved to tell fantastic stories about life.